One day after I buried my mother, I found my brother rifling through her recipe journal at the bakery counter. "You're bleeding this place dry with your daily handouts," David snapped, slamming the worn leather book shut. My flour-dusted fingers trembled as I reached for it, but he pulled it away, his eyes cold and calculating. Without a word, I grabbed the brown paper bag I'd prepared before dawn and walked past him to the front door, the familiar weight of freshly baked bread a comfort against my palm. The old man was there on his usual bench across the street, his weathered military jacket hanging loose on his frame. I crossed the morning quiet road, my red bakery apron catching the early sunlight. As I placed the bag on the edge of the bench, careful not to intrude on his face, he looked up at me with startling clarity in his pale blue eyes. "Elizabeth would be proud of you for continuing," he said, his voice rough like sandpaper on old wood. I froze. In 3 years of this silent ritual, he had never spoken. More unsettling was his use of my mother's name, a name I had never shared with him. "How did you?" I began, but was cut off by the bakery door slamming behind me. "So this is your charity case?" David's voice sliced through the morning quiet. "The reason Mom's legacy is falling apart?" The old man studied my brother with a soldier's assessing gaze before reaching into his jacket pocket. He withdrew a yellowed photograph and held it toward me with gnarled fingers. "I think it's time you knew the truth, Sophie," he said quietly. I took the photo with shaking hands. There, standing beside a much younger version of the benchman, was my mother in a nurse's uniform, somewhere dusty and foreign, her arm around his shoulders, both looking exhausted, but alive in a way I'd never seen in our family albums. "Who are you?" I whispered. "Staff Sergeant James Cooper," he replied with quiet dignity. "And I've been waiting years to give you this." From his other pocket, he produced a small brass key. Behind me, David sucked in a sharp breath of recognition. "That's Mom's storage key," he said, his voice suddenly uncertain. I closed my fingers around the cool metal, feeling the weight of secrets it might unlock, as the old soldier nodded once more, our familiar silent goodbye, and slowly rose to leave. The morning ritual of baking had always been my sanctuary. Even as a child, I would wake before dawn to help my mother prepare the day's offerings. The rhythm of measuring, mixing, and kneading was a dance we shared in comfortable silence, interrupted only by the occasional instruction or the timer's insistent ring. Now, 2 weeks after the funeral, that ritual was both salvation and torment. Every movement echoed her absence, yet performing these familiar tasks was the only time I felt close to her. I checked the proofing sourdough, its slightly sour smell filling the kitchen as I fired up the stone ovens. 4:30 a.m., right on schedule. By 5, the first batch of croissants would be ready, followed by country loaves, then the specialty breads. My hands worked automatically, scoring the tops of rustic bowls with swift, practiced movements. My mother's voice seemed to guide each motion. "The pattern matters, Sophie. It's not just decoration, it's how the bread breathes." I blinked away tears, focusing on the task before me. By 6, the cases would be full, the windows would steam with warmth against the cool morning air, and the scent would draw the early risers of the neighborhood. And at 6:15, I would prepare the paper bag. The special morning bag had been my mother's tradition long before it became mine. "Everyone deserves fresh bread," she'd say, carefully selecting items that weren't quite perfect enough for the display case, but were still delicious. A slightly lopsided croissant, a bowl with an irregular scoring pattern, a cinnamon roll from the center of the pan where they tended to be softer. I never questioned who the bag was for until I was 12, when curiosity finally overwhelmed me. I had followed her one morning and watched as she placed the bag beside an old man on the park bench across the street. No words were exchanged, just a nod, a silent acknowledgement. When I asked her about it later, she simply said, "Some debts can never be repaid, but that doesn't mean we stop trying." After she got sick, I took over the task. The old man and I developed our own silent communication, a nod, sometimes a faint smile. We never spoke. I didn't know his name or his story. But every morning he was there, and every morning I brought him fresh bread. Until today. I emerged from the bakery, paper bag in hand, and felt a jolt of concern. The bench was empty. In 3 years, he had never missed a morning. I stood there, uncertain, the weight of the bag suddenly heavier in my hands. The early morning crowd at the coffee shop across the street was whispering and pointing in my direction. I'd grown used to the sidelong glances and judgmental murmurs about my handouts to vagrants, but today their attention seemed different, almost pitying. He won't be coming. I turned to find David leaning against the bakery doorframe, his arms crossed over his expensive suit. My brother had barely left the bakery since our confrontation 2 days ago, poring over financial records and making hushed phone calls. "What did you do?" My voice came out sharper than I intended. "I didn't do anything," he replied, pushing off from the door and approaching me. "But I did some research after he gave you that key. Do you have any idea who James Cooper really is? Or why Mom was feeding him for what must have been decades?" The photograph and key burned in my pocket where I'd kept them since our meeting. I hadn't shown David the photo. Something had held me back, the same instinct that now made me wary of his smug expression. His name is James Cooper. Former staff sergeant, Vietnam veteran, and apparently, David's voice took on an edge, the original co-owner of this bakery. "Did you know that, Sophie? That a homeless man owns 20% of our mother's legacy." The bag crumpled slightly in my grip. "That's impossible. Mom started this place herself." "No, she didn't. I found the original business papers in the office safe. Cooper and Elizabeth Wilson, equal partners at founding. He sold back most of his share years later, but kept a stake." David's eyes narrowed. "The question is why? And why did Mom keep feeding a man who could clearly afford his own bread?" "The bakery is fine," I said automatically, though we both knew it wasn't entirely true. Since Mom's medical bills had started piling up, we'd been struggling to stay afloat. "It's not fine, Sophie. And I'm not letting Mom's life work disappear because of some mysterious obligation to a man we don't even know." David checked his watch. "I have a meeting with Mark Sullivan from First National at noon. He thinks we can leverage Cooper's stake to restructure the debt." "You can't do that without his consent," I said, my voice rising. "And it doesn't explain where he is now." "The VA hospital," David replied dismissively. "Apparently he collapsed yesterday afternoon." The nurse found my contact information in his wallet. He shrugged at my shocked expression. "What?" "I visited him. Asked some necessary questions. He wasn't particularly forthcoming." I looked down at the paper bag in my hands, then across at the empty bench, now seeming forlorn in the morning light. "I need to see him," I said firmly. "Sophie, this is ridiculous. We have real problems too." "I need to see him," I repeated, already untying my apron. "Margaret can cover the morning rush. This can't wait." The key in my pocket seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. I knew without being told that it would unlock more than just a storage unit. It would open the door to whatever my mother had wanted me to know but couldn't bring herself to tell me while she was alive. The VA hospital smelled of antiseptic and instant coffee. I followed the nurse's directions to room 317, the paper bag still clutched in my hands. I'd insisted on bringing it, ignoring David's eye-rolling. Some rituals were sacred, especially now. I paused outside the room, hearing low voices inside. One was unfamiliar, crisp, official, with a military cadence. The other was James Cooper's sandpaper rumble. "Should have told her years ago, sir." "Not my story to tell, Lieutenant." Elizabeth had her reasons. With all due respect, Sergeant Cooper, those reasons died with her. And now, I knocked softly and pushed open the door. James lay propped against pillows, looking smaller without his bulky jacket, but somehow more dignified in hospital-issued pajamas. At his bedside stood a young officer in full dress uniform, his cap tucked under his arm. "I'm interrupting," I said, starting to back out. "No," James said quickly. "Come in, Sophie. Lieutenant Hayes was just leaving." The officer straightened. Actually, sir, I think I should stay for this conversation. James gave him a look I couldn't interpret, then sighed. Fine. Sophie Wilson, this is Lieutenant Michael Hayes. He's been helping me with some matters. Hayes nodded respectfully. Ms. Wilson. I'm sorry about your mother. She was an extraordinary woman. I blinked in surprise. You knew my mother? Only through Sergeant Cooper's stories, he replied carefully. And the letters. Letters? I moved further into the room, setting the paper bag on James's tray table. His eyes crinkled at the corners, the closest he ever came to a smile. You brought the morning bread, he said softly. Some rituals are sacred, I replied, echoing my earlier thought. James nodded, then gestured to the chair beside his bed. Sit, please. We have much to discuss and not much time. He glanced at Lieutenant Hayes. Your brother's meeting at the bank isn't the only appointment today. My stomach tightened. How sick are you? Sick enough, James replied matter-of-factly. Heart's finally giving out. But that's not what matters now. He reached for the key I still carried in my pocket, somehow knowing it was there. Did you use it yet? I shook my head, pulling out the key. I wanted to understand first. The photograph, you and my mother. David says you co-owned the bakery. I did. She needed capital. I had some savings. His eyes grew distant. The baking was all her, though. I just handled the business end until she got on her feet. But why would you invest in a bakery? And why has my mother been feeding you for decades if you were her business partner? None of it made sense. James exchanged a glance with Lieutenant Hayes, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Because before we were business partners, we were something else, James said carefully. We were in Vietnam together. Your mother was a field nurse with a medical aid organization. I was a combat medic. We saw things, did things, came back different. The photograph suddenly made more sense. The exhaustion in their eyes wasn't just physical. Mom never talked about Vietnam, I said quietly. She told us she was in nursing school during those years. She was both, James confirmed. A student who volunteered. She wanted to help. We all did, in our own ways. Lieutenant Hayes cleared his throat. Sergeant Cooper is being modest, Ms. Wilson. He was a decorated medic who saved numerous lives under fire, including your mother's. I turned to James, who shrugged uncomfortably. It wasn't heroic. I was just there when the shelling started. We were in the same field hospital near Saigon. Incoming mortar fire. I pulled her under a surgical table. His gaze grew distant. Anyone would have done the same. But they didn't. You did, I said softly, beginning to understand. And she spent the rest of her life thanking you with bread. James shook his head. It wasn't gratitude. It was connection. When we came back, nobody understood what it was like. The nightmares. The constant vigilance. The guilt. His voice roughened. Your mother and I found each other at a veterans support group. We helped each other remember how to be human again. I thought about my quiet, composed mother, the woman who jumped at sudden noises, who checked the locks 3 times before bed, who baked through the night when she couldn't sleep. How had I never seen the signs? The bakery was therapy, James continued. Creating instead of destroying. Feeding instead of harming. It helped her heal. And the morning bag? I asked. A small smile. That started later. After I sold my share back to her when she married your father. After my wife died in '94, she was worried I wasn't eating properly. The morning bag became her way of checking on me without making a fuss. I swallowed hard, thinking of all the mornings Mom had carefully packed that bag. All the mornings I had continued the tradition without understanding its significance. But why the bench? Why not just invite you in? James's expression shuddered slightly. Your father had concerns about our friendship. He never quite believed there wasn't more to it. Easier to keep some distance. The bench was our compromise. The pieces were starting to fit together, but something still didn't make sense. Then why give me the key now? Why tell me all this? Lieutenant Hayes stepped forward. That's where I come in, Ms. Wilson. The VA has been working with community businesses on a veteran support initiative. Sergeant Cooper has been advocating for your bakery's participation. Lizzie, your mother, and I had been discussing a program, James explained. Using the bakery to help veterans like us. Providing job training, a safe space for those struggling to reintegrate. She called it the Morning Bread Initiative. When she got sick, we had to put it on hold. And now David wants to sell the bakery, I said, understanding dawning. That's why you finally revealed yourself to me. James nodded. The key opens a storage locker at Public Storage on Maple Street. Inside is everything you need to understand. The full plans for the initiative, your mother's journals, our correspondence over the years. She wanted you to have them when the time was right. And the time is right now because you're dying and my brother is selling, I concluded bluntly. A flash of that almost smile again. You have your mother's directness, he said. Yes. Those documents include some financial information your brother should see before he makes any decisions. There's a small trust fund set up for the bakery, not much left after your mother's medical bills, but enough to prevent a hasty sale if used wisely. Lieutenant Hayes checked his watch. It's 11:30, Ms. Wilson. Your brother's bank meeting is at noon. I stood up, clutching the key. I need to go. James reached out and caught my wrist with surprising strength. Sophie, whatever happens with the bakery, remember this. Your mother conquered her ghosts by creating something that brought joy to others. The building, the business, they're just vessels. It's what you do with them that matters. I looked down at this man who had been part of our lives without my knowing it, this silent guardian who had helped my mother heal and who had watched over me from a distance. Thank you for saving her, I whispered. We saved each other, he replied softly. Now go save what matters to you. The public storage facility was only 10 minutes from the hospital, but each second felt precious as noon approached. Lieutenant Hayes had insisted on driving me, his military efficiency a blessing as he navigated traffic. Sergeant Cooper has been planning this for months, he explained as we pulled into the facility. Since your mother's diagnosis. He wanted to respect her wishes to handle it in her own way, but she ran out of time. I finished, a familiar ache in my chest. Unit 227 was small, barely larger than a closet. The key turned easily in the lock, revealing a space dominated by a single filing cabinet and several cardboard boxes, each neatly labeled in my mother's precise handwriting. Letters, journals, Vietnam, bakery business, morning bread initiative. My God, I breathed. An entire secret life, archived and waiting. We don't have time to go through everything, Hayes reminded me gently. But Sergeant Cooper was specific about what you needed for today. He reached for a large manila envelope sitting on top of the filing cabinet, my name written across it in unfamiliar handwriting. These are the trust documents and the original bakery partnership agreement. He said they would help with your brother. I opened the envelope, scanning the legal documents inside. Most meant little to me, but one caught my attention immediately. A handwritten note from my mother, dated just weeks before her death. My dearest Sophie, if you're reading this, then you've met James properly at last, and begun to understand that family extends beyond blood. The bakery was born from darkness, but created to bring light. The morning bag is more than charity, it's connection. The bench is more than wood, it's an anchor. James is more than a customer, he is the reason I found my way back from war. The trust enclosed should prevent David from making hasty decisions about the bakery's future. Use it wisely. The Morning Bread Initiative was my dream for this next chapter, a way to help others find their way back through simple acts of creation, just as I did. Just as James helped me do. Trust your instincts. Forgive your brother's practical mind. It serves its purpose, as your heart serves yours. Create something together that honors not just my memory, but all those who struggle to find their way home. Love always, Mom. Attached was a legal document detailing a small trust fund, not large, but enough to challenge any immediate sale of the business. I checked my watch. 11:50. We would never make it to the bank in time. I need to call David, I said, reaching for my phone. Already handled, Hayes said with military efficiency. I took the liberty of contacting the bank directly while you were reading. Your brother's meeting has been postponed pending new financial information. I looked at him with newfound appreciation. Thank you. He smiled slightly. Sergeant Cooper has been planning this operation for some time, Ms. Wilson. I'm just following his tactical assessment. I glanced back at the storage unit, at the boxes containing my mother's hidden life. I want to take one more thing, I decided, reaching for the box labeled journals. Inside were several leather-bound books similar to the recipe journal she kept at the bakery. I selected the earliest one, dated 1970 to 1972. As we drove back toward the bakery, I opened to a random page. March 15, 1971. The nightmares are back. Jay says to write it down instead of letting it consume me. A recipe, he says, for processing grief. So here it is. I killed a man in Saigon. I was 23, working as a field nurse. He had a knife. I had a scalpel. Sometimes we become what we fear to survive. Jay understands this better than anyone. I closed the journal, my hands trembling slightly. The mother I thought I knew, gentle, meticulous, occasionally sad but always composed, had depths I never imagined. Layers of experience that shaped her in ways I was only beginning to understand. When we arrived at the bakery, David was pacing outside, his face a storm cloud of frustration. He started toward me as soon as I stepped out of Hayes's car. What the hell, Sophie? The bank called to postpone because of new financial information? What did you do? I held up the manila envelope. I found Mom's trust fund. The one that's been paying your Harvard MBA loans. The one that gives me veto power over any sale of the bakery for 5 years after her death. His face went slack with surprise, then hardened. Where did you get that? From the storage unit Mom shared with James Cooper, the veteran you interrogated in the hospital yesterday. I nodded toward Lieutenant Hayes, who stood at parade rest beside me. And this is Lieutenant Hayes, who's here about the VA contract that could save the bakery. David looked between us, calculation replacing anger in his expression. What VA contract? The Morning Bread Initiative, I said, the name feeling right on my tongue. Mom and James were planning it before she got sick. A program using the bakery to help veterans like them readjust to civilian life. Veterans like them, David repeated slowly. What exactly are you saying about Mom? I handed him the journal, open to the page I'd read. She was in Vietnam, David. As a field nurse. She saw combat, experienced trauma. She started the bakery as a way to heal. With James Cooper's help. He read the entry, his expression shifting from skepticism to shock. This can't be real. There's an entire storage unit full of evidence, I said quietly. Journals, letters, photographs. Our mother lived an entire life we knew nothing about. Lieutenant Hayes cleared his throat. If I may, Mr. Wilson, the VA has been looking for community partners for our veteran reintegration program. Your mother's bakery concept was exceptionally well developed. There would be significant grant funding available if you were to implement it. David looked up from the journal, his businessman's mind clearly calculating this new information. How significant? Enough to stabilize the bakery's finances and expand into the vacant storefront next door, which the proposed plans indicated would be a veterans' meeting space and training facility. I watched my brother absorb this information, saw the moment when financial pragmatism overcame his resistance. I'd need to see the numbers, he said cautiously. They're all in the storage unit, I confirmed. Along with a lot of other things you need to see. I hesitated, then added, Mom kept a lot of secrets, David. But I think she always intended for us to find them, just not until we were ready. He handed the journal back to me, his expression unreadable. And you think we're ready now? I think we don't have a choice, I replied honestly. James is dying. The bakery is struggling. And Mom left us a roadmap to fix both problems. We just have to be willing to see it. For a long moment, David didn't respond. Then, with a decisiveness that reminded me painfully of our mother, he nodded once. Let's go see the storage unit. All of it. Dawn light filtered through the bakery windows as I fired up the ovens, the familiar routine of comfort after a night spent reading my mother's journals. David and I had stayed up until the early hours, poring over the documents from the storage unit, piecing together the life our mother had kept hidden from us. The trauma she experienced in Vietnam, the suicide attempt after she returned, meeting James Cooper at a veterans support group, their shared healing through creating a business together, the bakery's early struggles, my father's jealousy of their bond, the compromise of the bench, the gradual development of the Morning Bread Initiative concept as they both aged and saw younger veterans facing the same struggles they had. It was like discovering a parallel universe where our quiet, practical mother was a wounded warrior who had rebuilt herself through flour and fire. David had taken the financial documents home to study, his initial resistance dissolving in the face of actual data and the possibility of grants. Lieutenant Hayes had promised to expedite the VA's review of the initiative proposal, and I had returned to the bakery to do what my mother had taught me: bake bread for the living and remember the lessons of the dead. As I shaped the morning's first batch of sourdough, I heard the bell over the door chime, too early for customers. I looked up to see David entering, carrying a cardboard box from the storage unit. Couldn't sleep either? I asked, surprised to see him before noon, let alone at 5 a.m. He shook his head, setting down the box. Been going through the financial projections for the initiative. Hayes wasn't exaggerating. The grant funding would be substantial. He hesitated, then added, I also read some of Mom's later letters to Cooper. The ones about us. I stilled my hands in the dough. What did they say? That she was proud of both of us. That she hoped someday we'd understand why the bakery mattered so much. He pulled out a chair at the small workstation table. She knew I thought it was just a struggling small business. She knew you thought it was just her passion. Neither of us saw what it really was. Her salvation, I said quietly. And maybe it can be that for others, he agreed, surprising me. He opened the box and pulled out a folder labeled Architectural Plans. The initiative would require renovating the space next door, knocking through that connecting wall we've always talked about. I wiped flour from my hands and joined him at the table, examining the plans. My mother's vision was detailed: a series of workstations for training, a community table for meetings, a small coffee bar. Practical and welcoming, just like her. We could do this, I said, excitement building. With the grant funding and the trust, we could actually make this happen. David nodded, a new resolution in his expression. I spoke to James's doctors this morning. He's being released today, but... He hesitated. There's no long-term prognosis. Weeks, maybe months. I felt a pang for this man I was only beginning to know. Then we need to move quickly. I want him to see this happen. I was hoping you'd say that. David actually smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since the funeral. Because I've already called a contractor for an estimate, and Hayes is bringing James here this morning for coffee and to review the plans. For a moment, I just stared at my pragmatic, business-minded brother who had been ready to sell our inheritance just days ago. Who are you, and what have you done with David Wilson? He laughed, the sound strange and wonderful in the bakery's morning quiet. Let's just say Mom's journals gave me some perspective. And... He hesitated, then continued, I want to do right by her. The real her, not just the mother I thought I knew. The timer dinged, calling me back to the ovens. As I pulled out golden loaves, the bell over the door chimed again. Lieutenant Hayes entered, supporting James Cooper, who looked frail but determined, his weathered face brightening at the bakery's familiar scent. Fresh bread, he said appreciatively. Just in time for the morning bag, I replied, reaching for a paper sack. David stood, extending his hand to James with newfound respect. Mr. Cooper, thank you for coming. We have some plans to discuss. As the men settled at the table with my mother's architectural drawings, I prepared the special bag, this time selecting the perfect croissant, not the misshapen one, adding a warm cinnamon roll from the center of the pan. And the best bowl with my most precise scoring. No longer charity, but connection. Not obligation, but honor. When I placed it on the table beside James, he looked up with a real smile, the first I'd ever seen transform his weathered face. Your mother would be proud, he said quietly. Of both of you. We're just continuing what she started, I replied. That's all any of us can do, he said, his gnarled hand resting on the plans for the morning bread initiative. Continue what others began. Honor their stories by creating our own. Outside, the morning light strengthened, illuminating the empty bench across the street, no longer a mystery, but a symbol of resilience, of connections that endure beyond understanding, of the simple power of fresh bread offered without expectation. We would transform that symbol now, expanding it into something greater. A place where other wounded warriors could find their way back through the simple, healing acts of measuring, mixing, kneading. Where trauma could be reshaped, like dough, into something that nourished both the maker and those they served. As I moved back to my workstation, running my hands through flour and beginning the day's next batch, I felt my mother's presence beside me, not as the woman I thought I knew, but as the complete, complex person she truly was. A wounded healer who had found her path forward through fresh-baked bread and silent rituals of care. Soon, the morning customers would arrive. The cases would fill. The scent would draw people in from the street. And the legacy would continue, deepened by truth, strengthened by understanding. Some debts can never be repaid. But in continuing to try, in the daily offering of what we create with our hands and hearts, we find our way home. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think small acts of charity, like daily bread offering, matter more than large donations? Have you ever experienced how regular, consistent giving can build unexpected bridges between people? What's your view on businesses incorporating charitable missions into their core operations rather than just donating profits?